Time for another What We Read.
That's
to talk
right.
about the books that we've been, well, books and comics that we've been consuming.
It's just been comics all year. It's so hard. But I'm reading.
I know. I'm going to kick things off by talking about two books that are part of the same series. The two books in question are from the Night Hunter series by Janine Frost. The first book is called Halfway to the Grave. The second book is called One Foot in the Grave. The first book is primarily the one I'm going to talk about because talking about the second book would be extra spoilery.
Sure.
The first book centers around a half-human, half-vampire named Kat, and she is basically killing vampires in the hopes that she's going to find the deadbeat dad that got her mom knocked up and murder him, because, you know.
Sure, that's the correlation that I can... What?
Anyway,
Continue.
She ends up crossing paths with a vampire bounty hunter named Bones, and they end up having a partnership.
A wild time.
Because they end up teaming up in order for Kat to get what she wants and for Bones to get what he wants in this book.
Fine.
And obviously something happens between them because this is an urban adult paranormal romance. Right. And I will say, going into this one, I was like, I think it's going to be fun, but I could not have anticipated how much fun I would have with it. It was just really entertaining. First of all, the plot is great. It's honestly like watching a CW show, and sometimes that's just what you want when you're reading. But I also thought it was smartly done. I just think the vampiric lore is pretty good in it, and I also like that the main character isn't just someone who needs to be rescued or someone who's a little too naive. She's actually kind of badass from the start, even without the help of this vampire bounty hunter.
Sure.
And then you throw their dynamic into the mix and it just gets better because they're basically like, and this is a comparison that is not new, a lot of people have made it, Cat and Bones are basically like Spike and Buffy. That's basically the dynamic they have, and my gosh, it works so well for them. Like, I thoroughly enjoyed their banter and their relationship blossoming in this first book. It was just so much fun. And the wisecracks were great. The action scenes were pretty cool. The mystery that they're trying to solve in it is also pretty fun.
And you do love a good mystery.
And it was just great. It was just fun. And I like that it's the kind of story where there was a resolution to it. And it ended.
Good. Hey.
And it ended on a solid note, except that I also was like, oh wait, but I need more. Luckily, this is a series, so obviously I got to read the next book, One Foot in the Grave. And that one was just as good, if not better. It's funny because there's actually a time jump between the books. I think it's like 3 or 4 years before they see each other again. And I'm like, sometimes when I read a series and the couple is the same couple as the first book, it doesn't always like end up holding my interest as much because I'm like, oh, they got their ending. Like, I don't need to. In this case, I'm just like, no, I will happily read more about Cat and Bones. Like, anything. Give me anything and I'll be happy, because everything I loved about the first book dialed up by 10 in the second book. So like more action, more mystery, more funny stuff. It was so enjoyable, and I'm really enjoying the series, and I'm so excited to keep going, especially after how the second book ends, because I'm like, did not see that coming, but you know what? Let's just roll.
Interesting.
Let's just roll with it. I listened to both of these books on audio, actually, which I borrowed from the library, and I don't know, I think it might have just made it more fun too, because I think listening to all of this happen, it makes it feel like a movie, even more so than reading it, and I'm having a really good time with that. I Want to Be Where You Are by Christina Forrest.
Very nice.
This is the story of a ballerina named Chloe who is determined to go to an audition for a ballet school, except that the audition is happening in like a city that's a little bit far away, and so she's going to take an impromptu road trip on her own without telling her mother.
Ooh.
Except that her next door neighbor, who used to be a friend of hers and is no longer really a close friend of hers, ends up blackmailing her because he finds out what her plans are, and he needs her to give him a ride. So it's basically road trip shenanigans between two former friends, and I really enjoyed it. It's a short story, and it's definitely one of those where it's like, it'll cover part of these characters' lives, and it doesn't feel like you're getting a whole, full, complete story. You're basically getting road trip shenanigans. I really liked it. I think the author did a great job of giving us this character dynamic together, but also giving us individual stories for both of these characters where you were rooting for them to like be able to figure out the solution for them to be able to chase the dream that they wanted to chase, because her former best friend is an artist and would like to pursue that in school, and that Chloe, as we already said, wants to be a ballerina and wants to pursue that as well. And it was just fun. They had a lot of shenanigans on this road trip, and it made for a very entertaining read. But I also liked the fact that there was like a heartwarming aspect to the story where you see that these two characters are really just, they're struggling to reconcile their dreams and the expectations that are being put on them. and I think that was a very key component of the story. So I ended up really enjoying it. I'm glad I finally read it, and I definitely will be checking out other books from this author.
Lovely.
An adult classic that I actually enjoyed. This is actually probably the first one that I read this year that I really enjoyed. It's a book called The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. It is basically essentially what the title says. It's about 4 characters. They end up house sharing this
Sure.
old sort of property in Italy for a month in April. And these 4 characters are very different from one another, and it starts off with them kind of being complete strangers, but then eventually the magic of being in the Italian coast, on the Italian coast, gets to them, and they start warming up to one another, and also warming up to their different circumstances and the things that they're personally dealing with. I will say the beginning of this book is slow, but once they do get to Italy, things start getting really interesting, and I think I started really liking the characters once they were in Italy. It was just, they each had their own thing that they were trying to deal with, and I really appreciated seeing that on the page. Things wrap up a little bit too quickly at the end for my tastes, and there's a lot of stuff where it's more implied than it is stated.
Right.
But otherwise, I actually quite enjoyed it. I thought that the way that this author wrote about, you know, getting away from your normal everyday life and going on a vacation, and the way that she describes the Italian countryside, they were all very compelling and very much reeled me in to the story, and I ended up really liking the 4 different characters, the 4 different women that were in the household together. I don't know, it took me a while to warm up to one of them, but almost immediately after I did, it was just nice to see them sort of become who they are by the end of the book. So definitely enjoyed it. This is a classic that I would recommend reading. I'm glad I read it, and yes, I did read it in April.
Lovely.
Alright, your turn.
My turn. Every so often, like DC and Marvel will come up with some kind of world devastating apocalypse that is not the real world devastating apocalypse in the main sort of canon, right? So, and this particular piece is called DCeased, where it's just a D and then a C and then an East, because a techno-organic virus with the powers of all of the anti-life equation gets released into the whole world, killing almost every superhero and human and metahuman on the planet, and turning them into mindless zombies that spread the virus and want to kill everybody. And so it's World War Z apocalypse style meets the DC sort of like universe. And so obviously who would be first? I guess the people who were closest to the screens with their phones, they get affected. And so the entire thing is sort of narrated by Jimmy Olsen, who sort of wanted to pay tribute to the heroes that have fallen. And already it's very dark. What I loved about this thing is that it, unlike the other 2, you know, Elseworlds series that I sort of mentioned, this hits more of the canon beats in a non-canon world. And I guess that's, and it's sort of almost a cheat, right? Because whilst the other 2 sort of really didn't start off with anything canon-ish to begin with, this is really just, let's take canon, draw a line over here and say, what if at this point in time this happened? And so you've got the survivors. You've got Damon Wayne, who sort of survived. You've got Jonathan Kent, you know, Clark and Lois's son, who survived as well, and a bunch of others sort of figuring out, what do we do in this world now that has been magnificently decimated? So I loved every single story arc. I loved every single character. Again, it's kind of like Love Actually, but you know, where it's different people's perspectives, but how do they all survive the apocalypse together? How do they fend off the greatest of threats that is happening right now in the form of, not too spoilery, but Black Adam gets infected. And you've got somebody who's got Shazam-y powers, who's might as well be on the same you know, thing as Superman, leading an army of the undead, just spreading that crazy virus. Some of them are metas too, and they keep their powers even as undead. So it's high stakes, crazy World War Z stuff set in a DC sort of like universe, and I really liked it. That was my, like, it's been a while, and it hits so many emotional beats that I'm just like, oh. And that's what I love about DC. It reminds me that this is why I many times prefer DC storytelling than Marvel storytelling, because they really get to the heart of the characters and really play out the emotional beats so well, the interactions. And yeah, I recommend it if you like a good Elseworld. I enjoyed it more than Injustice, interestingly enough.
The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually a collection of short stories. Nice. It's called That Way Madness Lies. It was edited by Dahlia Adler, and a bunch of authors contributed to it. This is essentially 15 different short stories inspired by a bunch of Shakespeare's works, both his comedies and his tragedies, and even one sonnet. So I went into this one with pretty optimistic hopes, or like pretty high hopes, just because I like Shakespeare a lot and I like his work a lot, and it's always interesting to me to see what authors decide to do with classic works like Shakespeare, how they can transform it into something that feels new and refreshing but also ties back to the source material. And I think all of the authors in this particular collection did a great job. There are some stories that I preferred more to others. I didn't know anything about any of these stories going into them, so it heavily leaned towards contemporary stories, but there were also a few that were a little more historical. There were tiny bits of magic woven in throughout. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun just seeing, you know, Shakespeare told in a more modern way with some of the key elements of some of these stories, and I really like seeing that on page. I think it's a great way for people who are not necessarily really big into Shakespeare to sort of get an introduction into the hallmarks of each of his stories.
Ooh, I like that.
That makes it very interesting and intriguing. And I also liked that all of these writing styles worked well together. Like, these stories felt like a cohesive collection despite the fact that there are definitely a whole bunch of authors writing them. So I enjoyed that a lot. I definitely liked the short story collection. It's always hard for me to do a rating for them because, like, it depends on the story, really. But yeah, overall, I would highly recommend checking this one out.
Awesome.
The book I'm going to talk about next is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse.
Yes.
This is an adult fantasy series starter that is set, or inspired by at least, pre-Columbian America.
Oh.
Which makes it very interesting. It
Oh, yeah,
centers
totally.
around a particular event, a solstice that is going to be happening.
Interesting.
And there is supposed to be a solar eclipse on this solstice, which has significance to a lot of people. It has significance to the sun priest of the city of Toba, who is in charge of all of their sort of rituals and all of that stuff. It also has significance to a person named Ciala, who is captaining a ship that launches bound for Toba and has to get there before the solstice, and is bearing a young man named Serapio, who has a prophetic connection to this solstice happening. And I'm gonna leave it at that, and I know that sounds a little vague, but I think it's best to go into this book not really knowing what's gonna happen. It's this beautiful mix of like this cultural, these cultural, I guess, elements combined with a prophetic sort of backdrop, and also a lot of political intrigue and twists and turns. I did not anticipate getting really invested in the story the way that I did, especially because I actually listened to this one on audio, thanks to Libra FM. But it's so good. Like, it was so fascinating. There was definitely no holds barred when it comes to the brutality in the book. That's a big factor in a lot of it. No one is really safe in the story either. That's definitely made clear very early on. It was just fascinating from start to end. It has a lot of fantastical elements that I really enjoy. Like I said already earlier, the cultural details were really interesting because there's such a wide variety of them, and they all felt like something I had never really encountered before. And I'm also a sucker for stories where, like, there is a convergence point for all of our narrators. And yes, this is a multi-narrative story.
Nice.
So I love when there's a convergence point and you know it's going to happen, but you don't know what exactly is going to take place once we hit the convergence point. And obviously I was a sucker for the fact that there's like a whole prophecy thing that's built into the story.
Right.
There's a whole aspect of like the gods being involved in what happens next.
Like that.
It was just so interesting and so fascinating, and I'd never read anything quite like it, and I'm trying to think of like if there's something I could even compare it to it, and I don't think so. So yeah, I really liked that one. I was really impressed by what it did and how compelling it was from start to end, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the next one when it's out. I think it's this year. Legendborn by Tracy Dion, which I finally read. So the thing about Legendborn is that it had been getting so much hype that I was so nervous going into it, because I'm like, what if I don't like it as much? Which tends to happen when a book gets overhyped in my head. But I shouldn't have worried, because I ended up really liking Legendborn. So Legendborn centers around a character named Bree, and she goes off to UNC for like a sort of summer early college type program with her best friend. But while she's there, she discovers that there is a secret society of people, and their secret society is founded on the principles of Arthur and the Round Table. And they also deal with the supernatural. And it just so happens that Bree realizes that maybe the thing that happened with her mom might have a supernatural reason behind it. And so she finds herself trying to infiltrate the society in order to seek out the truth. Except that when she does infiltrate the society, she realizes there's definitely a lot more going on than anyone could have ever anticipated. And I really enjoyed this story. I'll admit it wasn't the kind of story where like I was dying to read it every time I put it down. You know, like when I put it down, I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to pick it back up right away. But whenever I was reading it, I was so sucked into it that I would read like a huge chunk of it and be like, this is so interesting and fascinating.
Sure.
The way I've described this to a lot of people is that it feels like a CW show. And I mean that in the nicest way possible, where like it combines a lot of familiar tropes, but in a way that's very entertaining and really pulls you in. It specifically reminded me of The Vampire Diaries. I'm not gonna lie. That's the show
that energy.
It has that energy in a good way. I liked the fact that Bree's personal journey, her grief journey, and her journey towards discovering a little bit more about her mom and her own history is woven into this bigger world of like Arthurian lore and legend and their secret society. It made for a really interesting mix of things, and it all blends together so well in a way that I could never have anticipated when I started the book. I like that there's a huge cast of characters. While we spend most of our time with Bree and, you know, dealing with her stuff, we do get glimpses of everyone else who is involved in the secret society or uninvolved in it, and we see the sort of role or impact they have on her life. And like I don't know how Tracy Deonn came up with this lore or this like backstory for Bree, but whatever she did, it was magical because it turned out so well. Like it's just woven in so perfectly together that I could not help but love it. Like
beautiful.
I was so, especially towards the latter half of the book. The first half of the book is a little bit slower because it sets everything up. Like you have Bree getting to the school, and Bree sort of, we're getting an introduction to her grief, and we also get to sort of know about this secret society of people. But it's really in the second half when things start to escalate where you start to see all these connections and like just the way that it all comes together, mind-blowing. Like,
just think about it this way: every time they did come together, Alexa would be like, "Did this happen next?" I'm like, "Oh my gosh!" So I was actually like there when she was reading all of it.
It was just so impressive.
Cool.
I was so impressed by the time I reached the end of this book. Impressed, but also mad that I had to wait to read the second book, which I don't even have to wait as long as people who read it last year, so I shouldn't be complaining. But
the reveals are just
they're very good. It was just so good.
I didn't read it. I thought it was
I am just like very excited about this book series. I think it's just a duology, so we should be getting the ending this year, which I'm very excited about.
Very
so
nice.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna throw my hat in the hype ring. I'm gonna say that this is one that you should definitely check out if you haven't already, because it's just that good. The last book I'm going to talk about is one that I actually read because of my friend Lily from Utopia State of Mind. I'm going to link her channel and her blog down below. It's a book called Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet by Laken Zaya Kemp, and this I actually listened to because I got a copy for free from Libra FM for their ALC program. It was so good. I feel like this is another one of those books that's gonna fly under the radar a bit because I don't think I've seen a lot of people talk about it. Lily's actually probably the only one I've seen on my feed actually mention it, and it's such a shame because it's so good. It's about a young woman named Penelope Prado, and she really wants to be a part of her family's restaurant's legacy, but her dad seems hell-bent on giving that legacy to her older brother instead, and they want her to become a nurse, even though that's not her passion. And at the start of the book, she decides that she's going to tell them the truth, that she wants to, you know, be involved in the restaurant, and she wants to bake. And they end up giving her an ultimatum, and so she has to find a way to pretty much survive on her own, and she ends up crossing paths with a young man named Xander who has just started working at the restaurant when she is forced to quit her job there.
Oh boy.
And he, on the other hand, is trying to find his father, who left his family a long time ago, but he's also dealing with the fact that he's actually undocumented.
Oh no.
So that's also something that becomes a point of contention.
That is hard.
Throw in the fact that there's this power-hungry individual who basically holds a lot of sway in their small town, who is trying to, I guess, confront Penelope's dad and, you know, take over the property that the restaurant is in. And it makes for a very, like, heart-wrenching, complicated story. I really appreciated how it felt so realistic, all of the things that both Penelope and Xander are going through, the feelings that they're having, the experiences that they basically have to face in their daily lives.
Sure.
There's a lot of conflict that is very relatable, where it's like they're both basically trying to find a place where they belong, and they both have an idea of what that place is or what they need to do to get there, and the hard part is for them either taking that first step or just standing firm in where they are and just witnessing that journey is so powerful and so moving. I also like that the family dynamics and even the community relationship dynamics, they're not quite as simple as like a black and white situation where like, this is my dad, this is my mom. No, it's more complicated than that because there are a lot of different feelings involved and a lot of communication that doesn't come across the way that either person in the relationship would want it to. It's not all heavy. There's a lot of lightheartedness to it too, just because, like, for example, the whole staff at the family restaurant, they're very close, they're like family, and so they're there for each other, and you know, through all of the hard things that they go through. And Penelope's best friend is just a source of solid support for her from start to finish, which is also great. I don't know, I thought it was so magical to listen to the story. It's like one of those things where I didn't expect to get as swept up in it as I did, and I really appreciated that. I will say, like, it took a turn for the dramatic towards the end, which I was not expecting. Not a bad thing per se, but it was just something where I was like, oh, well, did not think we were gonna go there.
All right.
And I also, as much as I like her relationship, like their relationship, Xander and Penn, I was also kind of like, this kind of happened real quick though. I'm glad you guys are happy, but also
something just happened quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't really fault them for it. So I really enjoyed that. I'm glad I listened to it. I'm glad Lily recommended it. I would highly recommend checking it out if you've never heard of it. It was very, very good. That brings us to the end of this particular What We Read video. If you've got thoughts, questions, comments, leave them down below. You can also find us on all of the social media links that are included. And we'll see you guys with another video next week. Bye!